My name is Vethkel, and I have been selling secrets for 400 years. I am not proud of it. I am not ashamed of it either. It is simply what I do, the way a river simply moves downhill without questioning the direction. There is no philosophy in it. There is no drama. You find information that someone else does not have, and you sell it to the person willing to pay the most for it, and then you go home and you sleep without guilt, because information is not a weapon until someone chooses to make it one. That is what I always told myself. I believed it completely, for 400 years, without exception. I stopped believing it the night the freighter docked at Oryx 7. The station is not impressive. It sits at the outermost edge of council-mapped space, so far from the center of galactic civilization that the light from the nearest council world takes 11 years to reach it. The docking arms are old and corroded at the joints. The corridors are narrow and smell of recycled air and aging metal, and the specific quality of staleness that comes from being too far from anything for too long. The beings who come here are not diplomats. They are not officials. They are not anyone who matters in the larger machinery of galactic politics. They are traders, mostly, smugglers when business is good enough, refugees when things have gone wrong elsewhere. They come to Oryx 7 because it is the last populated outpost before the long dark between arms, and they need fuel, and they need food, and sometimes they need someone like me to carry a message somewhere that official channels refuse to go. I had been at Oryx 7 for 3 weeks, waiting on a deal that had not yet materialized. This was not unusual. Deals at the fringe moved slowly. Everything at the fringe moved slowly. Time itself seemed to drag out here, stretched thin by distance from anything that mattered. I had spent the 3 weeks eating in the station's single eating establishment, reading old intelligence files on my personal archive node, and watching the docking bay through the scratched viewport that looked out over the berths. I watched ships come and go the way you watch weather, when you have nothing else to do. It passed the time. I was sitting in the back corner of the establishment when the freighter arrived. I heard the docking clamps engage through the wall. It was a sound I had heard 10,000 times across 4 centuries of working the edges of civilized space. I did not look up from my meal. Then Oru appeared at my elbow. Oru managed the docking bay and owed me 3 favors from a complicated situation the previous year involving a cargo manifest and a council inspector. Oru was not the type to move quickly under any circumstances. Oru moved through the universe at the speed of someone who had decided, long ago, that urgency was for other people. Oru moved quickly now. "You need to come," Oru said. I looked up. Oru had 4 eyes, and in their species all 4 being open simultaneously indicated a level of anxiety that words typically failed to capture. All 4 were fully open. I put down my food and followed without asking questions, because in 400 years I had learned that when someone with that expression says, "Right now, you go." The freighter was small and beaten in the way of vessels that have been working hard routes for longer than their original owners intended. It was scored and patched and had one external panel that did not quite match the color of the panels around it. There were no visible registration markings, which was not unusual on the fringe. Ships that worked the outer edges often found registration marks inconvenient. What was unusual was the crew. They were a species I did not recognize. In 400 years, this had almost never happened. I know species. I know the major civilizations and the minor ones, the council members, and the unaffiliated, and the ones that the council had catalogued but never formally engaged with. I know their body plans, and their dominant colors, and the way they carry themselves when they are at ease, versus when they are afraid. I had never seen beings like these before. They were roughly bipedal, shorter than average galactic height, with pale skin that had a slightly blue undertone, and eyes that were large and dark in proportion to their faces. They had gathered at the base of the docking ramp with their bodies angled toward each other, the way beings do when they are trying to feel less alone, and several of them were showing the kind of involuntary physical indicators that, across almost every biology I had ever encountered, meant the same basic thing: fear. The one at the front, who had the bearing of a captain, was trembling, not from cold. The station ran warm enough. She was trembling from something internal, from whatever she had seen before this docking, and from the effort of standing in front of it and trying to hold herself steady. I introduced myself in the 12 most common galactic trade languages. On the 5th one, something shifted in the captain's expression. She understood me. "You are a broker," she said. Her command of the language was imperfect but workable. "You carry information from one place to another." "I carry all kinds of things," I said pleasantly. "What do you need?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked back at her crew, then at me again. And in that sustained look I saw something my 4 centuries of experience recognized immediately. It was the expression of a being who had seen something they did not know how to describe, and who was now making a calculation about whether describing it would make their situation better or worse. I had seen that expression many times. Usually it preceded a very interesting conversation. "We need you to tell the council," she said. "Tell the council what?" I asked. She said the word. A single word in her own language, which my translation implant took a moment to process because it was not in any of the standard databases. When the translation came back, it rendered as a species designation, a name for a people, a label for a civilization. It meant nothing to me at first because I had never heard it. It was not in my personal files, not in anything I had encountered in 400 years of work. Humans. I kept my expression neutral and my voice even, because in my line of work, showing that something has caught you off guard is expensive. While I kept talking to her, asking gentle orienting questions about where they had been and what route they had come from, I ran the name through my personal archive node. The search returned one file, single entry, low priority classification, dated approximately 200 years ago, which in archival terms made it practically ancient. A council survey team had cataloged a small planet in the third arm of the galaxy. The dominant species, biological, carbon-based, bipedal, and at the time of observation, firmly pre-space flight. The classification was Class 2 developmental primitive. The note said, "Observe if convenient, otherwise low priority." The file had not been updated since. Nobody had touched it in 200 years. I looked at the captain and let her tell me what she had seen. Her freighter had been running a standard supply route near the third arm, the kind of route that small independent operators run, because the major shipping companies do not bother with it, and the margins, while thin, are consistent. They had picked up a debris field on sensors and moved to investigate, because debris sometimes means salvage, and salvage keeps ships like theirs running. What they found was not standard salvage. The debris was large, and moving through it, with what she described in careful and specific terms as calm and methodical purpose, were ships she had never seen before, not council ships, not from any of the 37 recognized spacefaring civilizations she or her crew could identify. New ships, unknown ships. They moved through the debris without haste, without aggression, without any of the aggressive sensor sweeps that most military vessels deploy when they encounter an unknown in their space. She had held position for 6 hours. 6 hours of watching from a distance her crew judged safe, while the unknown vessels worked through the debris with what I can only describe as the body language of professionals who are good at their job and know it. Then, when they were done, they were gone, not through any drive sequence she could recognize. No gradual acceleration, no FTL windup, no gravitational bloom on the sensors. One moment the vessels were present, the next they were not. The space where they had been was simply empty, as if they had never been there at all. She had approached the debris field after they left. She had gathered enough fragments to identify the origin of the wreckage. It was a council border probe, one of the automated monitoring units that the council scattered throughout the outer arms to watch traffic and report anomalies. It had been disassembled, carefully, not destroyed, opened and examined and then left in pieces, but pieces that told a story of deliberate investigation rather than combat or accident. Were there other debris fields? I asked. She had seen what she thought were 2 others in the same region. She had not stopped to investigate because by that point her crew had made a collective decision about how much time to spend in that area of space. They had not spent any more. How long ago? I asked. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of hard travel to reach Oryx 7 and find someone willing to take the information further. I thanked her. I arranged fuel credit for her ship, enough to get them to the nearest properly inhabited system, where they could decide what to do next. I watched them seal the ramp and begin departure procedures. Then I went back to my corner of the eating establishment and I sat and I did not touch my food and I thought. I opened the archive file again. I looked at the entry for humans, Class 2, no space capability, low priority, 200 years out of date. I thought about what could change in 200 years. I thought about civilizations I had watched transform themselves in less time. I thought about what it meant that 9 council border probes had gone dark in the last month, because I had quietly checked that number while talking to the captain, and 9 was the count, 9 probes. The pattern of their disappearances, when I mapped it on my navigation display, moved in a single direction, inward, toward the center of council space, toward everything. I sat with that pattern for a while. I sat with the image of unknown vessels moving through debris with calm professionalism. I sat with the image of them vanishing without a trace. Then I opened a priority transmission channel to the High Council. It cost me substantially, because priority channels from Oryx 7 are not cheap. I composed the message carefully, methodically, with the precision I had spent 4 centuries developing. I listed the facts in the order of their significance. I made no dramatic leaps. I simply presented what I knew and noted, at the end, that the existing file on the human species was 200 years out of date, and that the current situation suggested someone should update it urgently. I sent the message, then I sat back and looked at the door of the establishment. The door was sealed, as it always was on pressurized stations. There was nothing unusual about it. It was a door I had walked through hundreds of times in the past 3 weeks. There was nothing on the other side of it except a corridor identical to every other corridor on ORX-7. I got up. I crossed the room and I engaged the manual lock. A small thing, a quick motion. Something I had not done in 400 years of working in places considerably more dangerous than this quiet cold station at the edge of the map. I went back to my seat. The archive file was still open on my node. One word in the search field. One species that nobody had thought worth watching for 200 years. And somewhere in the third arm of the galaxy, ships that appeared and disappeared like thoughts, moving through the dark with the unhurried confidence of beings who had already decided where they stood. I did not sleep that night. I did not sleep the next one either. I had been selling secrets for 400 years and I had never once lost sleep over any of them. I lay in my bunk in my rented quarters on ORX-7, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought about patience. About how long you would have to be patient to cross that much space without making a sound. And what kind of species chose patience as its first move, when it had the obvious capability to choose something louder? The answer to that question frightened me more than anything else. More than the vanishing ships. More than the open probes. More than the silence of 9 monitoring stations going dark in a line aimed at the heart of everything we knew. A species that patient was a species that had thought very carefully about what it was doing. A species that had waited, and planned, and only moved when it was ready. Ready for what? I did not know. I did not want to find out from the wrong side of it. My designation is Commander Dreyish, and I have led military vessels across 9-star systems for 200 years. Been in situations that most beings would not survive, and I have survived them. Not through luck but through preparation, discipline, and the accumulated experience of a career spent in the difficult spaces between civilizations. I am telling you what I found in the third arm of the galaxy. And I am telling it plainly, because there is no other honest way to tell it. 3 weeks after the High Council received a priority intelligence transmission from a broker stationed at ORX-7, I was assembled with 3 of my most senior captains and given a classified assignment. 4 ships. The mission: investigate the disappearance of 9 Council border probes in the outer third arm, confirm or deny the presence of an unknown vessel type in the region, and return with everything we could gather. Observe only, do not engage, do not provoke. Come back with data. I accepted the assignment with a professional calm I had spent 200 years developing. Outwardly, inwardly, I read the preliminary intelligence brief 3 times on the transit to the third arm, because there was something in it that kept snagging my attention in a way that good intelligence briefs normally do not. Good intelligence briefs are smooth. They flow from one fact to the next and build a picture that, however incomplete, has a coherent shape. The preliminary brief on this situation did not have a coherent shape. It had the shape of something seen in peripheral vision that vanishes when you look directly at it. The facts were present. They simply did not fit together into any framework I had ever used before. 9 probes missing. An unknown vessel type. A last known position report from a civilian freighter captain who had watched unknown vessels work through debris with clinical precision for 6 hours before those vessels disappeared without a drive signature. A council archive file on a Class 2 primitive species, 2 centuries stale, which was apparently the only record the council had on the beings operating those vessels. I kept reading the brief and I kept finding myself returning to the same line. No drive signature detected. I had read thousands of field reports in 200 years. I had never read those 4 words together before. Every drive system in the galaxy, regardless of its design, regardless of its efficiency, regardless of its power output, produced a gravitational distortion that sensors could measure. This was not a theory. It was physics. It was so fundamental to our understanding of FTL travel that nobody had ever seriously proposed it could be different. You folded space, and space pushed back in a way that instruments could detect. Always. Without exception, no drive signature detected. I filed that phrase and I went to work. The third arm of the galaxy is quieter than the inner regions. Fewer inhabited systems, fewer shipping lanes, fewer reasons for anyone to be there in significant numbers. The arm has always been treated as the back end of council space, the region that you cross to get somewhere else, rather than the region that is itself a destination. We made transit in 4 days, arriving at the first debris coordinate the broker had flagged. My sensor officer, a veteran named Nella Bright who had been reading space conditions for 90 years, and who I trusted completely, began her sweep before we had fully decelerated to observation speed. She did not say anything for the first 20 minutes. Nella Bright's silences were communicative in themselves. A short silence meant routine processing. A long silence meant she was finding something that required the full weight of her attention before she was willing to describe it aloud. 20 minutes was a long silence. When she spoke, she said, "Commander, the debris is sorted." I crossed the deck and stood at her station, and I looked at the display she had built of the field. It was detailed and color-coded, with each material type highlighted separately, and what it showed me stopped all of the mental frameworks I had been running and made me look at the situation without any of them. The hull composite from the probe, a specific alloy that Council Manufacturing used in all automated monitoring units, had been gathered into a single cluster near the western edge of the field. All pieces above a significant mass threshold were present in that cluster. None were scattered. The drive components, those that remained, occupied a separate area to the north of the composite cluster. The sensor arrays and their housings were in a third grouping, northeast of the drive components. The small fragment debris, the shards and particles that were too small to meaningfully categorize, had been swept to the outer perimeter of the field in a rough boundary ring, as if someone had wanted to keep the workspace clean. I looked at this for a while. I looked at the distance between the clusters, at the uniformity of the categorization, at the care with which the sorting had been done. Then I asked Nella how long it would have taken to produce this result. She ran the numbers. 4 to 8 hours, she said, depending on how many vessels were working simultaneously. 4 to 8 hours. Spent in the debris field of a council probe, carefully sorting its components by material type and function. Not scanning from a distance and moving on, not taking what was useful and leaving, staying, working, organizing, treating the remnants of our technology with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand every part of it before they were done. I asked the rest of my captains to begin surveying the surrounding region, while I continued examining the primary site with Nella. Over the next several hours, we found 2 additional debris fields matching the first, both sorted, both showing the same pattern of methodical disassembly rather than any form of conflict damage. In the second site, Nella found evidence of something that required her to run the analysis twice before she reported it. The probe's internal memory core, the physical unit that stored the probe's observational data and operational logs, had been removed, cleanly. The housing that held it was present, opened carefully along its seams. The core itself was gone. They had not copied the data. They had taken the hardware. They had wanted the actual object, not a replica of its contents, the thing itself. I stood with this for a while, and I thought about what kind of mind looks at unfamiliar technology and decides that copying the data is not enough. The kind of mind that wants to hold the hardware, to study the physical construction, to understand not just what the object does but how it was made, what materials were used, what the engineering choices reveal about the civilization that made those choices. That kind of mind was thorough, patient, interested in depth rather than surface. In the third debris site, we found the message buoy. It was ours, Council issued, one of the standard relay units we distributed throughout the outer arms to maintain communications infrastructure. Its original coordinates were logged in our navigation database. It had been moved approximately 40 kilometers from where it should have been. This was unusual but not by itself alarming. Objects drift. Gravitational interactions can relocate a passive unit over time. But when my communications officer, a young and meticulous being named Fen Cole, attempted a standard diagnostic ping, she found that the buoy was running new firmware, not corrupted firmware, not damaged firmware. Deliberately written, cleanly installed, fully functional new firmware that she had never seen before, and that our systems took several seconds to characterize before returning a description. Custom code, purpose-built to serve as a playback unit, holding a single audio file set to transmit on the first Council standard communications frequency that triggered it. She looked at me. I told her to play it. There was a brief gap of transmission noise and then a voice. I will not try to phonetically reproduce it. What I will tell you is that it was a sound I had never heard before in 200 years, and that my translator took longer than it had ever taken to identify a language sample before returning a result. Proto-Terran Standard, spoken by a species designated in Council archives as human, Class 2 primitive, third arm of the galaxy, last surveyed 2 centuries ago. The translator also returned a translation. I read the translation on Fen's display while the audio continued. I read it twice. Then I asked her to play the file again. Because I wanted to hear the voice while reading the words. Because sometimes the gap between what language says and how it sounds matters. The voice was calm. Not the careful calm of a diplomat choosing each word under pressure. Not the forced calm of someone trying not to show that they were afraid. It was the natural calm of someone who was neither afraid nor performing composure. Because composure was simply how they moved through the world. The voice said, in words my translator rendered cleanly into Council Primary, "We found your equipment, and we hope you do not mind, but we needed to understand how some of the components worked. and we have left everything we did not need in the field for your collection. If you would like to have a conversation, you know roughly where to find us. If you would rather not, that is also perfectly fine. No pressure either way. No pressure either way. I had Fen play it 4 times. 4 full plays while I stood at her station and listened with every part of my attention that I had spent 200 years training. I was looking for the edge, the threat beneath the politeness, the demand beneath the offer, the aggression that must be in there somewhere. Because in 200 years of military service, I had learned that when someone powerful tells you, there is no pressure, what they mean is that the pressure is simply too large to articulate. I did not find it. What I found on the 4th listen was something that was in some ways more alarming than a threat. I found a voice that was simply telling the truth. There was no pressure because they did not need to apply pressure. The power differential was already so clear that applying pressure would have been redundant. They were telling us in the politest possible way that they had assessed the situation and found it entirely manageable, and that our response to that assessment was a matter of our own preference. I called all 4 captains together for a full briefing. We talked through the drive signature issue first, because it was the most technically concrete thing we had to discuss, and military minds, mine included, are more comfortable with technical problems than with the kind of philosophical discomfort I was feeling about the voice on the buoy. 3 of my 4 captains went through the standard investigative sequence: sensor malfunction, masking technology, recording artifact. I let them make all the arguments, because they were good arguments and deserved to be made and heard properly. Then Nella walked us through the full sensor logs from all 4 ships, showing the simultaneous absence of any gravitational distortion across 4 independent arrays in the time window when the unknown vessels had been present. No single ship malfunction could explain it. No known masking technology could explain it across multiple independent systems without leaving its own signature. The data was clean. The absence was real. Whatever these vessels used to travel, it was not a modification of anything we knew. It was something fundamentally different, something that did not interact with space in the ways we understood space to be interacted with. We talked about the debris sorting. We talked about the removed memory core. We talked about the reprogrammed buoy and the voice and the specific quality of what the voice was communicating. We talked about the timeline, 9 probes over the course of approximately 1 month, all in a pattern that moved inward toward the center of council space. One of my captains suggested that the inward pattern might be coincidental. I thanked her for the suggestion, and I said nothing else, because the pattern was not coincidental, and we both knew it, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a good officer is let them make the argument and then let the silence answer it. I spent 3 hours writing my report that evening. I worked through draft after draft of the recommendations section, which I had never done before in 200 years of filing reports. My standard recommendation for an unknown contact in contested or borderline space was always the same: establish a military presence sufficient to demonstrate capability, then open communication from a position of clear strength. This was doctrine. This was how the Council had handled every first contact situation for 6,000 years, with variations in scale but not in principle. I sat in front of my draft recommendations, and I thought about that doctrine, and I thought about a civilization that had moved through our most heavily monitored space without leaving a single detectable trace, that had spent careful hours studying our technology in deep space and left a polite recorded message in our own hardware that communicated in Council Primary with the ease of a language they had practiced, rather than just learned. I thought about the difference between engaging something that needed to be shown your strength and engaging something that already knew exactly what your strength was. Then I typed my actual recommendation, which was the most unusual thing I had written in 200 years of service. Send diplomats, fast ones, not warships. The warships were not the right instrument for this particular conversation, and sending the wrong instrument to a conversation this significant was a mistake that would be very difficult to undo. I filed the report and I read it once more after filing, which I never do, because I wanted to see it clearly one final time. I wanted to see if it held up. It held up. It was the right recommendation. I was certain of that. But certainty and comfort are different things. And sitting in my command chair with the stars of the third arm quiet outside my viewport, I was not entirely comfortable. I was not afraid. Exactly. Fear is a thing you feel when you think something might harm you. This was more specific than that. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a very large thing and understanding, for the first time, the full dimensions of it. Whoever these beings were, whatever humans had become in the 200 years since a council survey team had glanced at them and written Class 2. Primitive and moved on, they had come a very long way from that classification, in every sense: the distance in capability, the distance in patience, the distance in what they chose to communicate and how they chose to communicate it. No pressure either way. I thought about that phrase for a long time after I filed the report. About what it took to mean that honestly. About the kind of civilization that earned the right to say something like that and have it be true. I hoped very much that we would handle what came next with at least some fraction of the grace they had already shown us. I am Grand Arbiter Sewell, and I have presided over the Galactic High Council for 300 years. I have sat in the Arbiter's chair through 4 major wars, the dissolution of 11 civilizations, the collapse of 2 suns in regions we administered, and the endless, necessary, grinding labor of keeping 37 very different civilizations pointed in roughly the same direction, without allowing any of them to destroy each other or themselves. I have heard things in that chamber that would break most beings who had not spent centuries building the interior strength to remain functional in the face of them. I have called sessions to order through genuine planetary catastrophe and the declaration of conflicts that I knew would outlast my own tenure. In 300 years, I had always been able to open a session within 2 minutes of sitting down. The day the humans arrived, I sat in silence for 6 minutes before I found the words. Let me explain what happened, because the events of that morning moved quickly, and the sequence of them matters. The morning session had been an ordinary one by council standards, which means it was layered and complex, and would have been alarming to any outside observer, unfamiliar with the volume of work the governing of a galaxy actually requires. We were on the 17th agenda item, a trade dispute between 2 member civilizations over mineral access rights in a shared border zone, when my senior aide Owen Marsh appeared at my shoulder. Owen had served at my side for 60 years. In 60 years, I had never seen Owen move with urgency during a formal session. Owen understood, better than almost anyone, that the appearance of calm in a seat of governance is itself a form of governance. Owen had interrupted me twice in 60 years, both times for genuine planetary emergencies. Owen leaned down and said very quietly 4 words, "They are already here." I looked at Owen. Owen's face said the rest of what I needed to know. I excused myself from the session without an explanation, which I had also never done, and walked with Owen to the primary monitoring center, which was 2 levels below the main chamber, and staffed around the clock by the council's best sensor analysts. The analyst on duty when I arrived was Clara Osi, who was young by council standards but had a reputation for rigor that more senior analysts sometimes lacked. Clara was standing very still in front of a display that covered most of the forward wall of the monitoring center, and she was looking at it with the specific stillness of a professional who has already processed what they are seeing and is now waiting for someone senior enough to share it with. The display showed the space around Valhora's Rest. Valhora's Rest was not chosen by accident as the location they appeared. I want to be clear about that. Whether they chose it deliberately or whether the significance was incidental, the effect was the same. It was the most symbolically loaded location in council space. 4,000 years ago, when the council was still new and fragile and finding its shape, a group of early delegates had established a permanent neutral station at Valhora's Rest as a statement of intent. The planet had since become the location of the council's oldest monuments, its foundational treaties, its archival centers. Every new member civilization sent a delegation to Valhora's Rest as part of their formal admission ceremony. It was not the political center of the council. It was something more lasting than that. It was the place that said, "This thing has been here for a long time and intends to continue." 23 vessels were now in orbit around that planet. They had not been there 6 minutes ago. Clara had the timestamp. She had the sensor logs from all 12 monitoring arrays assigned to the Valhora's Rest region. The logs showed clean space, clean space, clean space, and then vessels. No approach, no transit signature, no deceleration. Present. I stood at the display, and I looked at the vessels. They were large but not the largest the galaxy had produced. Their hull design was unlike anything in the council database. Smooth dark, with a surface that did not return sensor sweeps clearly, as if the material itself was doing something to the instruments rather than simply reflecting back. They held a loose formation around the planet, not aggressive in arrangement, not random either. It had the quality of a deliberate formation chosen to be unthreatening while making unmistakably clear that the number and positioning had been thought about. They held position. They were not doing anything except being there. They had not activated any systems that our instruments could identify as weapons. They had not attempted to approach the surface of the planet. They had not yet made contact on any frequency. They had simply arrived and waited. I asked Clara how the planet was reporting. "Multiple eyewitness accounts from the surface," she said. The observation networks confirmed the same timestamp. The response from the planet's local population was still organizing, but the tone of the early reports was consistent with what you would expect from 11 million beings who had looked up and found 23 ships in their sky that had not been there a moment before. I went back to the chamber. I walked the full length of the entrance corridor to the main floor, which is a long walk, and by the time I reached my chair, I had decided how I was going to handle the next few minutes. I was going to be clear, direct, and controlled. I was going to call the session back to order and present the facts without editorializing, and allow the chamber to respond through its proper processes. This was what the council had procedures for. This was what 300 years of experience had prepared me to manage. I sat down. The chamber had already received something through various private channels, because the noise level was dropping before I reached my seat. By the time I was fully seated, the ambient hum of 11,000 ongoing conversations in 37 languages had reduced to something noticeably quieter. By the time I had been in my chair for 30 seconds, it was gone entirely. 11,000 beings. Complete silence. I looked out across the chamber. I looked at 37 species represented in their delegations, faces in every configuration biology produces, from the smooth pale surfaces of the Velhorans, to the crystalline structures of the Greth, to the dense layered forms of the beings from the deep gravity worlds. I had looked at this assembly thousands of times. I knew these faces. I had read them through wars and disasters and the ordinary accumulated drama of 6,000 years of galactic governance. What I saw now, across all of them, was the same. It was not complicated. It was simple, the way the most genuine emotions are simple. It was the expression of people who understood, all at once, that the world had just changed while they were looking elsewhere. I called the session to order. Then I read them what I knew. I read them Claire Ossie's timestamp. I read them the sensor logs. I read them the entry from the Council archive for the human species, including the date of the original survey and the classification it had received. Class 2 developmental primitive, low priority, no space capability. I let the date of that assessment sit in the room. I watched 11,000 delegates absorb the gap between 2 centuries ago and right now, between Class 2 primitive and 23 undetectable vessels in orbit around our most historically significant world. I read them Commander Driesh's field report, not in full, the relevant sections, the sorted debris, the removed memory core, the reprogrammed message buoy, the drive signature that did not exist, the voice that said, in Council Primary, that there was no pressure either way. I read them the intelligence summary that the Council's Archival Research Division had prepared over the preceding weeks. This summary had been assembled by a team working without sleep, and it showed. It was dense and in places internally contradictory, as different analysts reached to different conclusions from the same raw data. But its central narrative was consistent. Humans had known about the Council for approximately 100 years. They had been monitoring our signals, decoding our communications, learning our languages, and making a deliberate and sustained choice not to make contact until they decided contact was appropriate. During that same period, they had developed longevity treatments that effectively ended natural aging-based mortality for their species. They had expanded to 31 independent star systems. They had survived 2 internal conflicts of extinction-scale severity. Both conflicts had ended in unification rather than fragmentation. In every case in Council records, comparable internal conflicts had produced one of 2 outcomes: collapse or permanent division. No species had come through that level of internal disruption and emerged with a single unified voice on the other side. Not once. Not in 6,000 years of recorded galactic history. The human fleet that was now waiting patiently in orbit around Valhora's Rest was not the fleet of one faction among several. It was the fleet of a civilization that had somehow forged itself into a single thing. 31 worlds. Every government and colony and inhabited outpost, speaking with one voice. The communications that were coming in from that fleet were addressed to the Council collectively, in Council Primary, requesting formal first contact and a membership application process. The diplomatic representative identified herself and stated her intention to present credentials whenever we were ready to receive her. The tone of the communication was the same tone as the voice on the buoy in deep space. Calm, patient, comfortable in the way of someone who is not performing ease but genuinely possessing it. I finished reading the summary. The chamber stayed quiet. I called a recess of 1 hour, which was the first unscheduled recess I had called in 300 years, and I went to my preparation room and I sat alone and I thought, 300 years, 6,000 years before that of Council history, 37 civilizations managed and balanced and kept at great ongoing effort from consuming each other. All of it built on a framework that had survived enormous pressures and adapted to enormous changes and remained, at its core, the same structure that the founders had imagined: a council, a collective, a common table where the powerful and the less powerful alike had a voice and a vote. In 6,000 years, the council had never encountered a situation quite like this one. We had encountered powerful new civilizations before. We had encountered civilizations that arrived with capabilities that surprised us. We had gone through first contacts that were tense and difficult, and required years of careful management before trust was established. These were not new experiences. But this was different, and sitting alone in my preparation room, I tried to understand precisely how. The difference was informational. In every first contact situation we had managed, the Council had more information about the incoming species than the incoming species had about us. We had been watching them, cataloging them, building files. The asymmetry of knowledge had always been on our side. It was one of the structural advantages of being the established civilization that the newer one was approaching. You knew the language, you knew the customs, you knew the history. The newcomer was learning, and you were teaching, and that arrangement gave the Council a certain natural authority in how the relationship developed. In this situation, the asymmetry ran the other direction, completely. Humans had been watching us for a century. They knew our languages, they knew our history, they knew our political structures, our internal tensions, our decision-making processes, our member civilizations and their individual relationships with the Council. They had spent a century building a more complete picture of us than we had ever bothered to build of them. They had sat in the dark and studied us for 100 years, and decided, on their own schedule and their own terms, that the time was right, and then they had arrived not at the fringe, not quietly into the outer arm where we might have found them gradually, and managed the introduction, slowly, but at the exact center of our most symbolic space, in numbers that made a statement without needing to fire anything. This was not aggression. I did not read it as aggression, and I do not read it that way now. It was information. They were communicating, through the simple fact of how they arrived, precisely how much they understood about us, and precisely how capable they were, not to threaten, to establish an honest foundation for whatever came next. They were saying, we know who you are, we know what we are, let us proceed without pretending either of those things is other than it is. I went back to the chamber. I spoke for 20 minutes. I told the Council what I thought, which was a less formal register than the chamber typically operated in, but the situation did not seem to me to require the formal register. I told them that the deliberation would proceed, that every voice would be heard, that the process would be full and proper and complete. I told them that was our tradition, and our tradition had earned its continuity, and then I told them what I believed the outcome was going to be. I told them plainly, without softening it, because I thought they already knew, and the most useful thing I could do was to say it clearly, so that we could move past the pretense of uncertainty and toward the actual work. The chamber absorbed this, 11,000 faces. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Not frightened, not shocked. The silence of people who have just heard something true that they needed to hear said aloud before they could proceed. That silence meant more to me than anything else that happened that day. My name is Sheen, and I have been a xenoanthropologist for 62 years. I have spent those years studying a single species, filing 47 reports that were not read carefully, and waiting for the day when the information I had been accumulating would be too immediate to ignore. That day has arrived. I find that I have complicated feelings about it. I want to tell you what I know about humans, because the Council is about to make decisions about a civilization that almost nobody in this galaxy actually understands, and that gap in understanding is now a practical rather than purely academic problem. I am going to try to explain them as clearly as I can, with 62 years of evidence behind every word, and I am going to try to explain not just what they have done but why, because the why is the part that matters for everything that comes next. I began studying humans 62 years ago as a junior researcher at the Council's Xenological Survey Institute. My supervisor at the time was a veteran academic who assigned me the human case file as a training exercise. He was kind about it. He said it was good practice for a first independent study. He said Class 2 files were useful for developing basic methodology before moving on to more complex cases. He said I should treat it as a few weeks of work, file an update note, and come back ready for a real assignment. I opened the file on a morning like any other, and I spent a week reading it. The existing data was what you would expect for a Class 2 species on a low-priority planet far from the Council's center of concern. There were population surveys and basic biological classification data, and some atmospheric readings and a note from the original survey team that the dominant species appeared to be in an early industrial phase, prone to internal conflict, and of no significant interest to galactic affairs at this time. The note had a casual tone, the kind of tone people use when they are describing something they expect to remain exactly as it is. At the end of my first week, I asked my supervisor for expanded observational access. He was mildly surprised but approved it. Access to additional remote sensor data from the third arm was not a significant resource expenditure. He gave me 6 months. By the end of those 6 months, I had submitted a formal report that was 40 pages long, which was significantly longer than the report my supervisor had expected. I had reconstructed as complete a developmental picture as I could from 2 centuries of accumulated remote observational data, going back to the original survey and tracing every data point forward to the present. I had built population models and technological progression models and cross-referenced them against council records for comparable species at comparable developmental stages. What I found was not what the models predicted. Class 2 species follow a known developmental curve. The council has been watching Class 2 species for 6,000 years and the curve is well documented. Early industrial phase leads to advanced industrial phase over an average of 3 to 5 centuries, depending on population density and resource availability. Advanced industrial phase produces the conditions for early space exploration, which takes another 2 to 3 centuries on average to develop into reliable FTL capability. The total time from Class 2 status to functional spacefaring civilization, averaging across all the cases in council records, is approximately 600 to 800 years. In 2 centuries, humans had covered ground that the average species covers in 600 to 800 years. The question I spent the next 60 years trying to answer was why. The first thing I noticed was that they did not follow the standard deceleration pattern after major setbacks. Every species in council records, without exception, shows reduced developmental speed following significant internal conflicts or environmental catastrophes. The logic is simple. You lose population, you lose infrastructure, you lose institutional knowledge, you lose the social stability that advanced research requires. Recovery takes time. Caution follows catastrophe. The species that survives a near-extinction event does not immediately accelerate. It stabilizes. It rebuilds. It is careful. Humans were careful too during the immediate aftermath of their major crises. I want to be precise about this because the record matters. They did not emerge from their worst periods laughing and unaffected. They grieved. They struggled. The data showed population loss and social disruption and all the indicators of genuine difficulty. They were not magically resilient. They were not immune to pain. But within 1 or 2 generations after each crisis, the data showed something that I had never seen in council records before. Not recovery to baseline, acceleration past it. In every case I could identify in 2 centuries of data, humans had come out of a major crisis and within a generation were building faster, reaching further, and producing more significant breakthroughs than they had been producing before the crisis struck. I spent a long time trying to find a parallel. I looked through council records going back thousands of years. I looked at every species that had faced comparable adversity at comparable developmental stages. In no case did I find the same pattern. The closest things I found were individual instances of specific civilizations accelerating during particular periods, but always with an external cause, a resource discovery, a contact with a more advanced species, a technological transfer that catalyzed progress. Not internal acceleration following internal adversity, without any external input. Humans did it repeatedly, every time. From internal resources alone, I began to look at their culture for the explanation. Because when the data does not fit the standard model, the thing you have not looked at yet is usually where the answer is. I had access to a significant volume of cultural data, communications intercepts, broadcast media in the early period, and later, as their communications infrastructure grew more sophisticated, a much richer stream of cultural output, music, literature, visual art, their forms of public discourse, their philosophy, and their religion, and the arguments they had with each other about what mattered and how to live. I looked at all of it, and I looked for the patterns that ran across everything, the themes that showed up in every period and every cultural context, and every form of expression, regardless of what else was going on. Those deep recurring themes, the ones a species keeps returning to across centuries and across every form it uses to think out loud, are the most honest picture you can get of what that species fundamentally believes about itself. The themes I found in humans were consistent, across thousands of years of their recorded history, which predated the period I was observing. Their cultural output returned again and again to the same set of ideas. Endurance, the insistence that things could be different than they were, the conviction that difficulty was not the same as impossibility, the specific, persistent, almost belligerent refusal to accept that a story, personal or civilizational, was finished just because it had reached a difficult point. I found this in their oldest preserved literature, and in their most recent. I found it in their music in every tradition I could access. I found it in the arguments they had publicly about philosophy and governance, and the right way to organize a civilization. The arguments changed in their specifics across centuries, but the underlying assumption rarely did. The underlying assumption was that things could be made better. Not perfectly better, not easily better, but better, through effort and time and willingness to keep trying when the easy thing would have been to stop. I eventually found the concept I was looking for in a period of their history I was studying when this cultural thread was particularly strong. The word in their language did not translate directly into any council language, which told me something in itself. A concept that a species cannot borrow from elsewhere is usually a concept that the species developed to meet a specific need no one else had felt the same way. The closest translation I could build was spite, but as I said before, spite in council languages means something small and petty, and this was not small or petty. In human culture, the word described something closer to a philosophical commitment, the decision to thrive visibly and deliberately in direct response to everything that tried to stop you. Not to survive out of pure instinct, not to recover out of necessity, to actively, intentionally build something larger and more capable than what existed before, specifically because the forces that tried to end you thought that you could not. It was framed, in their cultural tradition, not as anger and not as revenge, but as the most complete possible answer to the question of whether you could be stopped. They had made this concept central to their civilizational identity. It showed up in how they celebrated their history, in which the moments they treated as most worth remembering were not their moments of uncontested success, but their moments of near failure that became transformations. Their great figures in cultural memory were not the ones who had easy paths. They were the ones who had almost not made it and made it anyway. This is why their crises accelerated them, not despite the difficulty but because of it. The difficulty in their framework was the thing that made what came after meaningful. You did not simply advance. You advanced in answer to something. And when the thing you were answering was your own potential ending, the answer you built had to be definitive. I need to talk about the patience, because I think the Council's security apparatus is going to focus on the technology, and the patience is more important. At some point approximately 100 years ago, humans detected the Council's existence. I know this from the signal analysis in my later reports, which trace the shift in their observational programs beginning from that period. Before that point, their astronomy was turned outward in general directions. After that point, specific Council origin signals began appearing in their reception data, and the direction of their most intensive observational work shifted accordingly. They found us by accident, the way most species find us, through signal leakage from our own communications infrastructure. And then, rather than immediately broadcasting their presence or attempting contact, they went quiet. They spent 40 years, by my best estimate, decoding what they had found. This is not a brief project. Council Primary is considered one of the most complex of the major galactic languages, with grammatical structures that require sustained exposure to develop intuition for. Most non-native species require between 15 and 40 years to achieve functional fluency. Human linguists apparently worked on this collectively and intensively, and cracked it in approximately 40 years, which is at the faster end of what the Council's own records showed was possible for species attempting it from scratch. Then they spent another 60 years watching us govern, watching our member civilizations interact, learning our political structures and our internal tensions and our historical relationships, watching us be exactly who we were, with all our imperfections and our complications and our 6,000-year history of managing a large, difficult, varied collection of civilizations that did not always agree. And they decided, at some point and for reasons that I hope the ambassador will explain to the Council in detail, that we were worth talking to. They chose to wait until they were ready. Not until they were powerful enough, because they passed that threshold decades before they made contact. Not until we knew about them, because we did not know until they wanted us to. They waited until they were satisfied with their own understanding of who they were dealing with, and what kind of relationship they wanted to build. They treated it as a decision that deserved the full weight of their attention and their time. And they gave it both. I cannot overstate how unusual this is. I have studied species at every stage of development. Species at the edge of spacefaring capability, in my experience, do not exercise this kind of patience. The instinct when you discover that you are not alone in the galaxy is to make yourself known, to announce yourself, to reach out and see what reaches back. The combination of having the capability to make contact and choosing to wait until the conditions felt right is not something I had seen before in 60 years of xenological study. The 47 reports I filed over 60 years said variations of the same thing, with increasing levels of evidence and urgency. This species is not what the file says it is. The developmental trajectory is unlike anything in Council records. They are advancing faster than any model predicts. And the specific combination of capabilities and cultural orientation that I am observing means that when they arrive, and they will arrive, the council needs to be ready to engage with them as genuine peers, rather than as a new admission, needing guidance. Nobody read those reports carefully enough. I say this not as a complaint about the individuals involved, though I spent some years making it a personal one. I say it now as a structural observation. The council's xenological classification system was not built to handle what humans represented. The Class 2 designation created a filtering mechanism that routed information about them to low priority queues, where it did not receive attention, commensurate with its actual significance. The system worked as designed. The design did not account for the possibility that a Class 2 species could be developing in ways the classification was not built to detect. What I hope the Council takes away from this, beyond the immediate situation, is that its own monitoring frameworks may have other blind spots. If one species slipped through the full length of a developmental arc without the system registering what was happening, there may be others that are not yet as far along, but that the same filters are misreading in the same way. But that is a future conversation. The immediate conversation is about humans specifically, and what the Council should understand about them going into whatever comes next. Here is what I know, reduced to its essentials after 62 years of observation. They do not have a simple relationship with limitation. Every other spacefaring species in Council records accepts at some level the existence of things that cannot be changed, boundaries that cannot be crossed, problems that must be managed rather than solved. This acceptance is not weakness. It is wisdom in most contexts. There are things that cannot be changed, and civilizations that understand this govern themselves better than civilizations that do not. Humans understand this intellectually, but they approach every apparent limit as a question rather than a conclusion. They have been wrong about limits before, and they know they have been wrong, and that knowledge makes them unwilling to treat any new limit as definitively final until they have tested it thoroughly. This is how they built the drive technology that leaves no signature. Every physicist in the galaxy agreed that it could not be done. Humans looked at that consensus and treated it as a challenge that had not yet been answered correctly, rather than a ceiling they should accept. This will make them an extraordinary partner for the Council's scientific and technical programs. It will also require the Council to develop new frameworks for how it manages civilizations that do not treat agreed-upon limitations the same way everyone else does. I have one more thing to say, and it is the thing that I think about most when I think about these 62 years and what they have amounted to. After everything I have observed, after all the data I have accumulated and analyzed and reported and re-reported, what I find most moving about humans is the simplest thing. They show up. Whatever they decide matters to them, they show up for it. Completely, with everything they have. I have never, in 62 years of watching them, seen them collectively decide something was worth doing and then not do it, not once. Not when it was difficult, not when the cost was high, not when the outcome was uncertain. That quality, more than the technology and more than the patience and more than any of the strategic capability they have clearly developed, is the thing that I believe the Council most needs to understand, because it means that when humans tell you they want to be useful, the honest interpretation of that statement is not a diplomatic gesture. It is a description of what they actually intend. When they say they want to fix things, they mean it. They are going to try. I am Grand Arbiter Sewell, and this is the last record I will make about these events, which is not to say the events are over. They are not over. They are just beginning. But this particular chapter, the one that started with a broker's locked door on a fringe station and ends in the oldest diplomatic room in the galaxy, is closing, and I want to record it while the details are still clear in me. The first contact chamber had not been used in 4,000 years. When the facilities team went to prepare it, they found that 2 atmospheric systems needed calibration, and 1 lighting panel had been inactive long enough that it needed time to reach proper operating warmth. They worked through the night before the meeting to make it ready, and by the time the session was scheduled to begin, the room looked precisely as it did in the archival images from the last time it had been used. The long pale table, the high ceilings, the narrow windows that looked out on the stars in the direction of the original founding worlds of the Council. The last species to be formally received in this room had brought a delegation of 40 individuals, dressed in formal ceremonial garments specific to their culture, accompanied by an honor guard of 12, and opened their presentation with a musical offering that had lasted 40 minutes and moved several delegates in the observation seats to visible emotion. It had been by all accounts a beautiful and memorable ceremony. Yara Cole walked in alone. She was small, by human standards apparently average, with gray hair kept short and dark eyes that moved around the room when she entered with the unhurried attention of someone making a genuine study of their surroundings rather than performing appreciation for an audience. She wore simple, Practical clothing, no ceremonial elements, no equipment visible, no guard, no aids. She carried a single document case, thin and dark, and she set it on the table beside her seat before looking across the table at me. She smiled first. In 300 years of formal diplomacy, I had never had a first contact representative smile at me before the opening formalities. It was not a violation of anything. The formalities had not yet begun, but it was unusual, and I found myself unable to quite categorize it in the space between when it happened and when she spoke. It was not a diplomatic smile. It was not a gesture of performed warmth designed to establish a favorable impression. It was the smile of someone who had been looking forward to this for a long time and was genuinely pleased to have arrived. Owen, 2 steps behind me, made a small involuntary sound that I chose not to acknowledge. I welcomed her to the first contact chamber and said her name. Because using the full title was the proper form, she said, "Thank you, Arbiter Sewell. I should tell you that I have been practicing that title for about 20 years. It is genuinely good to finally use it in context." She said this with the same casual matter-of-factness as the voice on the buoy, not bragging, not performing modesty either. Simply stating a fact about how long she had been preparing for this specific moment, because it was relevant information, and relevant information was the kind she preferred to put on the table early. I asked her to be seated. We sat across from each other at the old table, and I gave myself a moment to look at her properly before beginning. She looked back without any sign of discomfort at being looked at. She had the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for this conversation and was not about to let the last few minutes of waiting bother her. I told her that the council had questions. She said that she expected it did, and that she had answers for most of them, and for any she did not have answers to, she would say directly that she did not know rather than guessing, because guessing wasted both our time. She said this in a tone that was not apologetic about the preference and not aggressive either. It was simply how she operated, and she was telling me so at the outset, because it would save us considerable back and forth later. I found myself believing her immediately. This was not something I had planned to feel. I had planned to proceed with the careful skepticism appropriate to a first contact of this magnitude. I had planned to weigh every statement against every other statement for consistency. I had planned to do all the things that 300 years of experience in a room where the stakes were always high had taught me to do. She said one sentence and I believed her. Not naively, not by suspending judgment, but in the way you believe something when the specific quality of how it is said has the texture of truth rather than performance. She was a human who had spent 100 years of civilizational preparation and 20 years of personal preparation to sit in this room, and she had arrived without armor and without ceremony, and with the settled self-possession of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that honesty was the most efficient approach. We went through the council's formal question list. The FTL technology, she answered in clear terms, explained the broad principle, confirmed that technical teams were prepared to brief our physicists in detail, and noted, without any particular emphasis, that the initial theoretical breakthrough had been influenced partly by the study of council probe components. She said this directly, not dancing around it, in the same way she had offered not to guess when she did not know things. She included it because it was true and true things belonged in the conversation. The drive operated on a different interaction principle than council fold drive, she explained. Not a refinement of the same mechanism. A different mechanism entirely, one that did not produce gravitational distortion in the frequency ranges our sensors were designed to monitor. It was not a masking technology. It was genuinely invisible to our instruments because our instruments were built around a correct understanding of one way to fold space, and the human drive used a different way that the instruments simply were not looking for. She said they would share the underlying physics with the council fully, without conditions. She was specific about the without conditions part. Not as a negotiating chip, not as a gesture to build goodwill before asking for something, because shared knowledge was better for everyone, and humans had found, in their own internal history, that hoarding technical capability created instability rather than security. I asked about the memory cores from the border probes. She acknowledged it directly. She said it was the wrong choice, made at a time when they were not yet ready for contact and needed to understand the technology they had encountered. She said they had returned what they could. She did not offer elaborate justifications for why the circumstances had made it understandable. Wrong choice. They acknowledged it. They were sorry for the inconvenience it had caused the council's border monitoring infrastructure, and the specific components they had studied had contributed to the technical exchange the council was now about to receive. She said all of this in approximately the same number of words I just used to describe it. I have been in diplomatic conversations where an equivalent acknowledgement took 3 days of careful verbal maneuvering to arrive at and was still, never expressed as plainly as that. I worked through the rest of the formal list. She answered every question. Where she knew, she said what she knew. Where she did not know, she said so. She did not try to steer the conversation. She did not try to manage my impressions. She sat with the document case unopened beside her, and she answered my questions and looked at me steadily and was, entirely without apparent effort, the most honest person I had been in a room with in 300 years. When the formal list was done, there was a natural pause, and in that pause I asked her the question that was not on the list. Ambassador Cole, I said, what do you want? She was quiet for a moment, not performing consideration, actually considering. The quality of her stillness in that moment was the kind that comes from taking a question seriously. She looked at the table for a few seconds, not away from me but at the table, and then she looked back up. She said, the same things you want, I think, to continue, to go further than we have gone, to understand what is out there, and to build something with that understanding, to be part of something larger than our own systems. She paused, and something shifted slightly in her expression, an openness that had been present the whole time but became more direct. Also, we have been watching the council for about 100 years. We noticed some things that seem like they could work better, not as criticism of what you have built, because what you have built across 6,000 years is genuinely remarkable, and we have deep respect for it. More as an offer, from people who have been watching from outside and might be able to see some things more clearly because of that position, if that is something the council would be open to. I looked at her. We noticed some things that could work better, an offer. I thought about 6,000 years. I thought about the total accumulated weight of that history, the wars prevented, and the catastrophes managed, and the civilizations kept from extinction by the collective work of the structure we had built. I thought about how much of that history had been defined by what the council was trying to hold back, hold together, hold in some kind of manageable shape. I thought about how rarely in that history anyone had walked into this room with something other than a need or a claim or a demand. Not one species in 6,000 years had come in and said, we have been watching, and we think we might be able to help. Not one. I told her that the council would be open to that conversation. I told her the formal membership vote would follow proper procedure, that it would take the time it took, that no outcome was guaranteed by our conversation here. I said this because it was true, and because the council's integrity required it to be said. She nodded and said that was exactly right, and that they had not come to bypass the process but to participate in it, and that they were comfortable with the timeline. She said this last part with a slight shift in tone that I might have missed if I had not been paying close attention, a warmth that was not quite a joke but had the quality of one, the tone of someone who understood the full weight of the word comfortable in that sentence, and was choosing it deliberately. They were comfortable with the timeline. A species that had waited 100 years to make contact, that had crossed 40,000 light-years of monitored space without leaving a trace, that had arrived at our most symbolic location and simply waited for us to be ready. Yes, I imagined they were comfortable with timelines. The vote was held 3 days later. Owen brought me the result in my preparation room before the formal announcement. He stood in the doorway with the kind of stillness he used when the news was significant, and he was giving me a moment before he had to say it aloud. Unanimous, he said. All of them, he said. Every delegation, no abstentions, unanimous. In 6,000 years, in every vote the council had ever held on any matter, there had always been dissent. Sometimes minimal, sometimes significant, sometimes simply the principled objection of the few who believed that dissent was itself a value that the council's structure should preserve. There had been unanimous sentiment before, on matters of overwhelming collective interest, but the actual recorded vote had always contained at least a handful of holdouts, beings who were cautious or who had specific objections, or who simply voted no because they believed the council was stronger for having contrary voices. Not this time. I sat with that for a while. 11,000 delegates from 37 civilizations, every one of them looking at the same information, every one of them arriving at the same place. I thought about what that meant, not about the humans specifically, about us, about what it said that the full assembly of the Galactic Council, a body that had spent 6,000 years practicing the art of disagreement as governance, had looked at this particular situation and found itself without a single dissenting voice. I thought it meant that what we had all felt in the chamber 3 days earlier, the silence, the shift, the feeling of the world rearranging itself, had not been individual reaction. It had been recognition. The full assembly of the council, all of it, had recognized the same thing at the same time, and what they recognized was not threat and not loss. It was something that took me a while longer to name. Sitting alone in the empty chamber after the announcement was made, and the delegations had departed, the first contact chamber was quiet again. The lights had begun their automatic dimming cycle. The old table reflected the fading light in the long, slow way of things that have been polished by 4,000 years of careful maintenance. I sat at the head of it in a room that had last been used when the galaxy looked very different, and I thought about what had changed. A broker on a fringe station had locked a door for the first time in 4 centuries because something about a word in a search field had made him feel cold in a way he could not entirely explain. A field commander had recommended diplomats instead of warships because 20 years of military doctrine dissolved in the face of sordid debris and a calm voice on a reprogrammed buoy. A xenoanthropologist had spent 60 years filing reports that nobody wanted to read, watching a species become something the galaxy had no framework for. And then, at the end of all of it, a small woman with gray hair had walked into the oldest diplomatic room in the galaxy alone, smiled before the formalities, and offered to help fix things. We had been afraid. I will not revise that out of the record because it is true and the truth matters. The silence of 11,000 beings is not a neutral sound. It was the sound of a world that had just acquired a variable it had not accounted for, and fear was the honest first response to that. I do not hold it against any of us, but fear was not where we ended, and sitting in the empty chamber, with the lights dimming around the old table, and the stars visible through the narrow windows in the direction of the founding worlds, I thought about where we had ended instead. We had ended with a unanimous vote. We had ended with a species that had been watching us for a century, learning us, choosing us, offering to be part of what we were building, and to bring what they had built along with them. We had ended with a woman who had been practicing a title for 20 years, and meant it when she said she was looking forward to using it. I thought about what she had said. We noticed some things that could work better, not as criticism, as an offer, from people who had been watching from outside. That was the thing I realized, that none of the 37-member civilizations had ever quite been able to do. They were all inside the system. They had all grown up within the council, or arrived while it was already the shape of the galaxy. They had all been participants for so long that the parts of the structure that did not work quite right had become invisible through familiarity, the way you stop hearing a sound that has always been in the background. Humans had spent 100 years watching from outside. They had seen the structure whole, from a perspective that no member civilization had, and they had decided it was worth joining. And they had come, not with demands but with an offer. Not with force, but with patience. Not with the need to prove themselves, but with the settled certainty of beings who already knew who they were. I thought about all the futures that opened from this point, the technical exchanges, the scientific programs, the conversations that would happen over the coming decades and centuries as 2 very different kinds of civilization figured out how to build something together. The arguments, because there would be arguments. A species that had come this far by questioning every limit was not going to settle quietly into existing frameworks without testing them. The discoveries that would come from the collision of different ways of understanding the universe, the things that could be fixed. I got up from the table. I turned off the chamber lights manually, a small deliberate choice, the first time I had done it in 300 years of sessions. I walked to the door. I paused for a moment in the doorway and looked back at the room one more time, at the long pale table and the windows and the fading light. The galaxy had a new member. The galaxy had something else too, something it had not known it was missing and had not thought to ask for. I closed the door. Whatever came next was going to be the most interesting chapter yet. For the first time in 300 years, I was not just prepared for it, I was genuinely looking forward to it.